Okay, welcome to the Architectural Association public program. This is part of the open seminar series Plan the Planet. Tonight we are going to discuss possibilities of adding to the Gaia theory a completely different level, and that is the level of cognition. It's a real pleasure this evening to have Professor Timothy Lenton with us, and I just asked him how we should give him an introduction. Tim doesn't need an introduction, just a few elements of reference. Tim wrote an amazing book, Revolutions That Made the Earth, with Andrew Wolfson, who is your father figure, or someone who allowed you to enter scientific realm. Andrew Wolfson co-wrote Daisyworld, the model of a completely self-organizing planet with James Lovelock. So what we're discussing this evening is in the direct lineage of that project and how to now revise it, update it, and maybe completely transform it. And the hypothesis has a very computeristic early 2000s notion of 2.0. It's like with the internet 2.0, but you'll see it has nothing of that taste. Tim is a professor of climate change and earth system sciences at the University of Exeter, and is the founding director of the new Center for Global Systems, and which is an enormous endeavor to transform how we're thinking action, and particular transformative action at the time of radical transformation and in the new climatic regime. The session is structured very differently from the previous one, where we had a lot of people at the table, and it was really a pluralistic idea. Tonight, it's going to be more quiet. We're going to focus on going in depth into this idea of the new cognitive moment of Gaia, and we will start with Tim giving a short presentation, then it will be followed by a conversation between the two of us, and then, as usual, you will be all invited at the table for the convivial moment, because this is really something that we want to make clear. This is a way of the AA to think together, all together, the challenges that we're facing. And it's initiated and sprung by the AA Action Initiative to radically revise the way we think architecture, the way we practice architecture, education, and the way that we imagine the intersection of multiple problems. So towards the end of the evening, we'll share wine and bread. Please, it's not the Last Supper. Hopefully. But before we start, please join me in welcoming Tim Lenton at the Architectural Association.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out this evening. I guess we're all sort of familiar with the notion that we're living in a new geological epoch of our own creation, the Anthropocene. And I want to give a little bit of a historical backstory to how we come to be in this predicament of our own making in the first place. So this is a spaghetti diagram I drew over 15 years ago, but it was a summary of the last 4.5 billion years of Earth history. Things are going on above a timeline in the middle that are changes in the Earth's environment. Things are going on below the timeline, which are profound transformations in the evolution of life. including some so-called major transitions in evolution where new levels of organization of biological beings come about. And then there are some arrows, some connections between the living and the non-living parts of our, well, planet, you might say, Earth system, you might say, or Gaia, I might say. Anyway, out of all of that spaghetti, I will give a little brief summary of the fact that we can boil it all, a lot of this down into a series of pivotal moments or revolutions in the coupled evolution of life and the non-living planet. So basically, these revolutions I'll talk about briefly. Each is contingent on the previous one. Each comes about because of some extraordinary evolutionary innovation in some lineages or lineage of life. This ultimately leads to new waste products that transform the world. And then after some turmoil, we see the refinding, if you like, of stability and a new configuration to the whole Earth system. And we can only be here this evening to ruminate on our predicament now and how we should shape the planet going forwards because of these past revolutions. So anyway, to begin with, life has to solve a profound problem of cycling all the materials it needs to build its bodies, if you like. And that must have been a pivotal first revolution for the biosphere, to get hold of the material cycling of all the elements, the essential elements. You want me to come a little closer or a little louder? So the second revolution, in one lineage of what we call bacteria, an extraordinary metabolism arises that splits water molecules and throws out oxygen as a waste product. So the organisms that learn to do this didn't do it they don't produce oxygen for their benefit. On the contrary, it's just a nasty, damaging waste product for them. But ultimately, they completely transformed our world and the atmosphere in what I call the oxygen revolution, taking the situation towards oxygen being an important part of the atmosphere. Actually, after that revolution, we still wouldn't have enough oxygen to breathe. That took the third major revolution in Earth history, which is, after the oxygen revolution, we have the beginnings of complex cells. Scientists call them eukaryote cells. We're multicellular creatures built out of those eukaryotic cells. But the first complex animals and then plants and fungi only come about much more recently in Earth history in this complexity revolution. And that's tied up again with environmental turmoil, but also creates finally the kind of atmosphere that we could breathe, or if you like, could allow us to evolve. And now, so that was the book, and that's partly about the past revolutions, but the topic for tonight perhaps is how to view our present predicament and whether we can find a workable narrative, which is that we can accept that we're profoundly transforming our planet, the Earth system, Gaia. Could we transform it in a way that is for the benefit of our generations and future generations, the flourishing of humans, but that would have to be predicated on the flourishing of other life forms as well. So I don't know how familiar you are with the Gaia Hypothesis, so I just want to say a bit more about what the central realization was of my scientific hero, Jim Lovelock, in the mid-1960s. He essentially realized that the atmosphere that we're all breathing now is an extraordinary product of life. It's far from what you would expect on a world of physics and chemistry, which gives you an atmosphere like Mars or Venus there, dominated by carbon dioxide and a relatively chemically dull atmosphere. Instead, we live on a planet and we breathe an atmosphere that's rich in oxygen, but also has other gases, methane, hydrogen, that react incredibly quickly with oxygen and should all have disappeared if it was just up to physics or chemistry. And the only reason they coexist in some extraordinary chemical cocktail that we're breathing is because other living things are making them and remaking them all the time. But that atmosphere and its peculiar composition is stable over geologic periods of time. So not only is life totally creating the atmosphere we breathe, it's also, the hypothesis goes, that acting somehow to stabilize this unusual atmosphere. Now, we also have learned in the intervening 50 years that there have been a number of stable configurations to the atmosphere, and this is just a crude summary of how oxygen levels have had these. Oxygen has been stabilized at different levels through Earth history that I already hinted at. And just to emphasize, I suppose, that the times of abrupt change represent on that diagram a couple of the revolutions I mentioned. As I said, each contingent on the previous one, each necessary for us to understand how we're here this evening. Now, I don't want to give you a big science lesson, so suffice to say that it's an active field of research still to understand how on Earth things could have come to be this way, and in particular, how could the relationship of living beings interacting with their non-living environment have come to result in self-stabilizing properties, self-promoting properties of life, like the cycling of nutrients or the regulation of the climate, across a whole range of scales. So we are still working on an understanding of that, but we have some understanding, and it's a plural understanding of which tries to blend a form of scientific thinking that you would loosely refer to as complexity thinking or complex system science with evolutionary thinking that recognizes that information in its transmission and memory are pivotal to our understanding how we're here now and the history of our planet. So much for the past, you might say, but that's the picture of the past as we begin to understand it in the field I come from. It's through some extraordinary, it's still being understood processes, as I said, that we can be here as a species transforming the planet. Everything that's gone before, when we try to rationalize it scientifically, we presume that although dolphins are very smart, octopus are very smart, ant colonies can solve complicated problems, we don't think any other beings, aside from ourselves as a species, have a sort of conscious sense of how they're transforming the world. So everything that's gone before, it involves things that scientists like me would describe as feedback loops, and I'd use a language that we call cybernetic. I talk about self-regulation, but it's all happened automatically and unconsciously. It still created some magical properties for the planet, but the thing to talk about tonight is that we're here now, and we're, I think, at least in this room, collectively aware that we're transforming the world. We're transforming the composition of the atmosphere, we're transforming the climate, we're transforming the land surface, we're transforming the oceans, we're transforming this thing, this Gaia phenomenon, and we're aware of that. So we're perhaps the first species that has this collective awareness of the collective consequences of our actions. And we have that partly through technology, of course. We're monitoring and sensing our planet all the time. And I think at least some of us are perhaps consciously altering our behavior because we think our previous behavior was perhaps collectively not sending the planet on a good trajectory. And that consciousness, or that self-aware, collectively self-aware feedback is what's new in what I'm badly calling Gaia 2.0. And so the question is, in a sense, could humans, or are humans, adding some level of self-awareness to the Earth's self-regulation? So this is the idea I've been gestating with my friend Bruno Latour, so another of my intellectual heroes. And that's perhaps our topic for tonight, is to reflect a little bit on if indeed we're adding a little self-awareness to Earth's self-regulation, what form might that take? Bruno would castigate me for having a disembodied brain in the bottom of my diagram, because this conscious alteration of actions could only come about through whole whole beings, whole human beings in conversation with each other, I suspect. So we should put a little picture of a community, whether it's of architects or scientists, in the bottom container. Bruno would ask, who are the humans, if we are going to achieve this new layer of self-aware self-regulation, who are the humans playing this role? What sort of consciousness could be expected of them? And if we think it's a reasonable project for action as well as cogitation, which bits of prior Gaia, which elements might you learn from if we were collectively trying to design, create, plan, whatever language you prefer, a better future for ourselves in a Gaia 2? So if I can say a bit more, I would just say a bit more about what those lessons might be. And there's a very naive top-level things that might seem obvious, but if we want a flourishing future on the planet, there's no better example to draw from than the biosphere that's been creating its own flourishing for over 3.5 billion years, and it does it powered by free energy from sunlight. That's a cyanobacterium, one of the first organisms or colonial organisms that produced oxygen. That's the first monument to the cyanobacteria down at the Eden Project in Cornwall, which was a response to something we wrote in that book saying we should put up a monument to these extraordinary creatures. And this is a quick summary of how energy input to the biosphere and then the human part of it has changed over Earth history. But the simple message here is, of course, fossil fuel power is not the future. If it wasn't blindingly obvious already, solar power and the associated renewables are the future of a flourishing humanity. And it's not such a bleak picture right now. The price of solar energy and wind energy is competitive with coal power in China. It makes economic sense to put up a new renewable power station rather than a coal-fired one in China today. And within 20 years, it'll be economically the right thing to do to shut down an existing coal-fired power station with useful capacity left in it and replace it with a renewable energy capacity. So that's obvious. We need a renewable energy future. But the thing that gets less attention is that we would be wise to build a future in which we imagine remaking everything we want or need out of what we already have. So in the broadest sense of the word, a future built on material cycling. So this is a graphical representation of how the biosphere recycles materials in an extraordinary way. So without life, just the fluxes of gases coming out of volcanoes, they're abiotic, and the scale is logarithmic. And on the left, Earth, those are all the massive fluxes of gases, of materials being exchanged by the biosphere today. And that's why the biosphere is 1,000 or 10,000 times more productive than it would be if it was just relying on the inputs from the volcanoes. It's all bootstrapped itself into the current flourishing that allows us to be here. So it's again, basic message. If we want to plan a flourishing future, it would have to be based on extraordinary cycling of materials, including the built environment. And that would take some of the free energy we've captured from sunlight, because you can't cheat thermodynamics. Now, another element would be that we are in the process right now of finding our carrying capacity on this planet, and there are different population projections, but they're all set to max out, and at some point, some of them as soon as 2050, others around the latter part of this century, with an open discussion as to whether it'll be 9 point something up to 11 point something billion people. If it's on the upper projection, as this little rescaling of the Earth's countries shows, where the countries are weighted by their proportion of global population, this is a situation now with massive inflated density of people in China and India. This is what happens by 2100. You see around 3 billion of the extra people there are projected to be in Africa, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So I guess some of you are the architects, not me, but an architected future has to ask questions about what kind of planned environs or unplanned environs are those extra 3 or more billion people going to live in. Are they going to look like that, which I think is Dubai, or are they going to look like that, which I think are some of the worst slums in the world in Nigeria, or are they going to be something completely different again? So, a few more words. Other things we might take from Gaia or the biosphere is that it all runs on different living agents forming networks of change that ultimately have extended their influence in space from the microscopic to the planetary in scale, and in time from seconds or milliseconds out to 3.5 billion years. So never let anybody tell you that I can't have any influence as an individual, because innovations that started in one tiny invisible bacterium have gone on to change the world, and are the reason we're here to have this conversation. So life is profoundly networked, in case that wasn't already obvious. That's the network of pathogens among animal vertebrates. That's a network of fungal hyphae connected to one little, is it a larch seedling, I think? So I would say we've got to think about how we form networks and how we exchange information. And the biosphere, it's all about horizontal information exchange rather than hierarchical information flow and restrictions of information flow, which humans have got very good at. So the biosphere, including bacteria and what we call archaea, fantastic at exchanging genetic information horizontally and solving problems that way. Social insect colonies also built on horizontal information exchange more than on hierarchy, something we would call heterarchy. So I think that if we look at what is happening now in our collective response to the climate environmental emergency, not surprisingly, we're not seeing some imagined top-down global governance somehow materialize. Instead, all the interesting action is coming from the bottom up. It's from networks of human agents connecting together, forming networks that connect to other networks, be it you, me, school kids out on the street, transition towns movement, cities, mayors clubbing together. And it should also be obvious that the biosphere is regulating its material environment. And if we're in the business of discussing planning and architecture, we also need to think conceptually about how it's ecosystems, human or otherwise, that regulate and improve their environment that tend to flourish in the long run over ones that degrade their environments. And we've done a lot of degrading our environment, so it's pretty obvious that we need to reverse some of that in our world today. And I'm quite excited, I don't know if you are, about the movements that are popping up around the world where communities are coming together to redesign their own, what we call in the academic language, social ecological systems, their own connection to nature, if you like. So that's happening in the southwest of England where I am. It's happening in watersheds in North America where different communities are exploring different visions of the future. And it's even taking form in digital platforms. I quite like this one, which is a vision maker in New York City, which embeds all the historical data on how the city has grown and its parks have changed and land has been reclaimed and whatever, but it allows you, the user, to go into that digital space and explore a vision of how you might wish it to be for the future. Meanwhile, I'm afraid we're, of course, playing with fire, you might say, in changing the climate. We're changing the climate against a backdrop of an Earth system that isn't particularly stable. This is 650,000 years of repeated ice age cycles. Carbon dioxide's in blue, temperatures in white. There's a sawtooth-shaped pattern to that trajectory. Anyone who knows anything about electrical engineering or maybe cardiology knows that a sawtooth oscillation is not the sign of a stable system. It's a sign of a system on the bounds of instability, where, in this case, at the end of each ice age, there are kind of tipping point changes in the climate that propel extraordinary change, 5 degrees of warming, 120 meters of sea level rise at the end of an ice age. And now we push the CO2 up to there. And if I had another button, I'd show you in my lifetime, on current trajectory, the CO2 goes off the top of the slide. So that is bound to cause some convulsions in the climate. One of my favourite subjects is to try and disentangle what those might be. But none of us should wish for those climate tipping points. Instead, we should take it as a challenge to think about how we find or re-find a stable global configuration or relationship, if you like, with the climate as well as the rest of the biosphere. And the way we understand how stability has come about in Earth history, those billions of years, is through a very crude trial and error and the relationship between life and its environment. There are random changes where life transforms the planet, maybe for the good, maybe for the bad. If it's for the good, great, it's a stable configuration, it persists. If it was for the bad, which it sometimes was, you saw tumultuous changes. Life played a role in triggering things called snowball Earth events, in which the whole planet froze over and it nearly eliminated all life. But it reset the system, and you could go around the algorithm again. Eventually, the planet or the biosphere found stability, locked in, it persisted. But this is a very, very crude algorithm, and not one, as humans, we should wait to unfold for us. Instead, our challenge is perhaps, are we going to have to find and design instead a stabilized Earth? Because we're busy destabilizing the planet now. So we have to raise our sights and ask ourselves, well, how on earth, what does the plan for that look like? So to finish, the simple version of the historical narrative here is one of new levels of biological organization built on top of the previous levels. It started 3.5 or so billion years ago with the first cells, and they're learning to recycle all the materials they needed. Around 2 billion years ago, it took the form of more complex cells. Around 600 million years ago, it took the form of the first visible to us, if we'd been there, macroscopic multicellular life forms. Maybe 100, 150 million years ago, you see a new level of organization. You see insects forming colonies and starting to build a built environment, a termite mound in this case. 6,000 years ago, in human form, it's the first city-states, again, a built-in, planned environment. And then the question for the rest of the evening is, well, what new level of organizational form are we planning next? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think you are the only person I know that can do 6.5 billion years in 20 minutes with all the subtleties. But I'm really interested in this. We had a previous discussion on the multitemporal character of contemporary global thinking, and how we are moving very quickly from a linear notion of the evolutions to a more historical and condition in science, in particular climate science and Gaia science. So I would like to start really the discussion around the historicity of your interest, because as we previously discussed in the minutes before the roundtable, it seems on many levels that what you're doing is natural history.
Yeah.
But it's a natural history that is decoupled from national history.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in understanding from your perspective, from your, or better, from your trajectory, how does that operate? You know, how can you imagine such a amazing overview of the tipping points that have made nature and its historicity without reverting to the conditions of establishment of that very same discourse?
Well, like you, I don't think you can. I think it's natural for me to ask how things came to be. I think that I'm perhaps very old-fashioned and more like in a tradition of natural philosophy that was the beginning tradition in the Western canon, if you like. But that got lost in the 19th century approximately, when a sort of phylogeny of different disciplines factioned off in this country and elsewhere and left us ill-equipped for the predicament, the Anthropocene predicament we've created. So I think several of you probably heard of complexity science, and there's a kind of a view of the world as complex systems that I think is one element of what we need, but it's also a little ahistorical, and I firmly believe that it has to be combined with an evolutionary understanding of how things came to be, which is to say, we have to really wrestle with and understand the importance of information and memory and learning in the development or evolution of our biosphere and of our own situation. To me, that's perfectly natural, but I have to say it's a minority perspective, because most of my colleagues in, say, climate change science have only been trained to think about a snapshot of the world and its troubles as we see them now, and I think that might be true in other disciplines as well. And we miss something if we can only stare at the present through the snapshot lens of the present. So I'm not sure I answered the question well, but I feel firmly that we're in a time where we're all recognizing that if we're going to get out of an apocalyptic narrative of our creation, and when we're going to get onto a different narrative, we all, I think, understand that requires transformational change. That requires, I would say, revolutionary change, certainly evolutionary change. And if we don't understand how we came to be here and the processes of evolution that gave rise to it, we'd be flying blind trying to envisage or conceive of a credible way forward.
And so, if we need to be more aware in order to start influencing back Gaia, my question is, what happens to all the dissent about that awareness? What happens to all the troubles around what it means to have such a long history in 20 minutes? Because not everyone would somehow agree with that notion. For instance, as someone who's interested very much in the idea of a city, I might disagree on the fact that it's 6,000 years ago that we have settled condition. I might think that actually what we have there is just a moment in a very complex history of pillaging that becomes institutionalized. But we had settled systems far before that. It's just that we have little archaeological traces. So the social structures of the settlement were somehow predating the settled condition of agriculture in the form of money and power. So even just the last minute of your billion years is extremely contested. So my question is really about, how do you imagine a debate about this Gaia 2.0 unfolding across a variety of very, troubled human, let's say, not humans, people in the humanities?
Well, exactly. Many aspects of any history are always going to be contested, and I think that's fine as long as there are some broader truths within there that might usefully be extracted. So I would like to think that what I said about solar energy and about material cycling are harder statements to contest than any particular argument about when a particular level of organisation did or didn't come about. So I would say that partly we don't want to get, yes, well certainly we're as intellectuals we'll always be arguing over some details, and that is fine and healthy, and that's part of keeping a diversity of perspectives. I certainly tried to navigate this space carefully because it's extremely dangerous to go out advocating an agenda for society that's built on learning lessons from nature, because that has a very bad history, as some of you will be aware. Instead, if it's to be a reasonable proposition, it has to be underpinned by the idea that the kind of nature I'm talking about is a different kind of nature to the one that we're trained to think in terms of, at least in a Western civilized tradition. So what I mean is we've got to, that's why I talked about Gaia to begin with. We've got to first reconceive the nature of nature in the sense of it's other living beings trying to create their own conditions for survival and flourishing, and then having these extraordinary extended consequences. I'm drifting off your question a little,
no,
but
I think that's exactly where I was trying to push you.
One pivotal point. Yeah.
It seems on many levels that there could be a shortcut in the proposition, and that is that we ought to organize ourselves in order to somehow be in sync with nature. But what starts being quite obvious in your description is that is not the modernist project of nation state.
Precisely.
Which is built on an idea of cohesion, of population onto a specific part of the earth.
Yeah, I skipped, I decided not to give you all a few slides on the notion of dominion and Genesis in the Bible and Milton Friedman and everybody else who've pursued this tradition.
But tell us in 5 minutes.
Well, that we've, at least I have, I shouldn't say we, but at least I grew up in a tradition that was telling me that from Christian writings onwards that we're the superior species and we've been given dominion over all the other living things, etc. And we see that tradition turn into the modernist project that still presumes that, explicitly or implicitly. And it never sat well with me, let's put it that way. So we have to question that cultural framework and presumption in our wrestling with our current predicament, I think, because otherwise we just end up in a fairly futile situation where we decide we're going to put monetary values on things we call ecosystem services, and the magic of the market and the invisible hand is somehow going to rescue us from the problem that it's created. So we have to ask deeper questions about the nature of the world, and then how we change the nature of our relationship with it.
And how do you see yours and Bruno's notion of Gaia 2.0 interfering with all those attempts of naturalizing the market, of transforming it into a self-organizing model of ecology? Because it seems that is a moment where there is a number of frictions, and there's a tension in the work that seems maybe important to start unfolding. You're not proposing that we should mimic nature.
No.
Tell us more.
No, but I am suggesting that a new politics, if there is one coming or happening around us, is built from the bottom up. It's built from the people, us, coming together, wrestling with a predicament of our own making, which is that the climate is changing and convulsing around us, and if it hasn't hurt us and hit us yet, it's going to. And we weren't expecting that. It's the byproduct of, if you like, of this tradition that we were told or sold was that we had dominion over it, and we were just, like all other living things, passive adaptive actors on a stage set by geology or divine providence, you might as well say. That isn't the nature of the world in the first place, but I'm not trying to promote a glib agenda then of take model society on nature, but rather let's reinterrogate the nature of nature. And then when we look at our current predicament, perhaps it's like going back to the start of the Western philosophical canon, where, as I understand it, it's a while since I did my philosophy lectures as a student, but the people of Athens gathered around the fountain in the marketplace, I believe, and they wrestled with how to govern themselves and their city, and that's, I think, the predicament we are heading into, and we should perhaps embrace. We need to get back into that mode of being where we've got to rethink how we govern ourselves and our relationship with the other living things. And if there's some politics in this, it's that the other living agents need to be in the political equation. We depend entirely upon them. At some level, they don't depend on us, but they can be harmed by us. And they're also there trying to create their own conditions for flourishing. And we can't flourish without them, so we might be wise to bring them into in whatever form it takes. We may need to convene them in the conversation.
So, on many levels, the discussion seems dominated by how many people are talking about coevolution. But you are clearly coming from a completely different position. You're talking about Gaia, but I'm interested in how the idea of local devices of transformation, Gaia conditions, are then somehow triggering multiple conditions of cohabitation rather than coevolution. Tell us about the relationship between, in your mind, your Gaia 2.0 hypothesis of more cognitive capacity, and we can discuss later if it has to be human-only cognitive capacity, and these Gaia devices.
So I guess the premise, the foundation there, if I haven't made it clear already, is that whether we were conscious or unconscious, being alive, we necessarily are transforming our environment. As conscious, sensitive, thinking human beings, we're also transparently, obviously, always transforming our environment. I believe we at least have the capacity to design instruments of that transformation that I might call Gaia devices that might be designable to lead on certain principles or values that are fairly uncontestably going to promote long-term sustainability and flourishing, be they devices to get excess unwanted carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into something valuable, or be they devices that take parts of our built environment that's decaying or being rejected or being stuck in a landfill and turn it back into something of value to us, of long-term sustainable value. I suppose it's a vision of using a little bit of our collective awareness and our ability, I believe, to use some interplay with foresight of the consequences of our actions to deliberately design some instruments that can help us through these transformative times towards something we might agree on is a flourishing place to be, rather than what I believe would be essentially the collapse of civilization if we carry on business as usual.
In the little introduction we put in order to advertise the event this evening, we were thinking, how do we go about this discussion? And the only thing that we came up with was a reference to Cuvier, when the Baron was trying to explain the very short-lived history of geology to his fellow revolutionary citizens in Paris. And he could only think of explaining the revolutions that made the Earth in terms of the political revolutions that people were experiencing. So it's like a sort of a déjà vu situation where the beginning of geological scientists trying to disentangle themselves from the providence and the dominion conditions are somehow again mirrored in the contemporary forms, where we are trying to disentangle ourselves from what has happened in between. So I'm interested in understanding how you can imagine a revolution, or what you call tipping points, in the middle of them. How do you see a transformation happening from within?
With difficulty, I suspect, is the lesson from history. I think some of us, perhaps I'm not alone in the room, thinking that there's that we're in the middle of something now. How, whether we've widely advertised that to each other or not, depends on your perspective. But I think you've answered the question yourself in a way that it is inherently difficult to fully perceive a transformation or a revolution that you might be in the middle of. Possibly because who knows what the outcome forms are. They might be things that are hard for us to imagine. I guess we have enough clues, though, in simple terms, to say that what I've called carrying on business as usual is not a sensible or viable strategy. So at the very least, we might intellectualize the situation as, oh dear, okay, if I stay subscribed in neoliberal capitalism, I'm committing my kids, and they're 8 and 10 by the way, to a massive shitstorm of climate change and all the mass migration and horrors that that's going to bring this century, if I can be blunt. Or I could conclude intellectually and emotionally that that isn't a very sensible place to go, and I can't look my children in the eye and say, sorry, but that's what your generation has got. And then we just intellectualize and say, well, if there's something really bad coming, if we don't change our ways, then we have to create some transformative change in our mode of being, which is a bit of an oblique answer to the question, because it's basically saying you end up backing yourself into an intellectual corner where the only viable and human way forward is to want to incite change anyway. So that's a slightly obtuse answer to saying whether you can recognise you're in the middle of change, but it's the way I would verbalise to you in the simplest and but most blunt terms why I feel we have to want to incite collective change now.
I'm really interested in, because on many levels, a lot of your work resonates with the entire apparatus of the IPCC. In the language of Earth system, I know that you're Gaia, but no, on many levels it operates. For many, it could be easily plumped all together in that sort of the gigantic technical apparatus of modeling, and I'm, for one, very fascinated by that. And it's not a negative condition, but for instance, I'm extremely fascinated in the origins of that way of thinking that somehow bring us to also this institution and the notion of circularity and so on. But I want to delve a little bit more in what makes you completely different from that. because this is the discussion we were having before about providence. And can you tell us a little bit more? How can we distinguish, let's say, on one side, the entire notions of artificial intelligence and self-organization, Santa Fe Institute, and Maturana and Varela on the other side, and people like operating in IASA, from your work on Gaia, so that we can start approaching this beautiful four-letter word and make it a little bit more attentive, because we tend to associate it with all the other stuff, but I want to make it clear that it's not a mechanical entity.
Okay. It's a very organic entity, exactly. So, couple of answers here. One is what I'm trying to convey, is a more organic view of the world in simple terms, more organic than the tradition of complex systems thinking, which derives from cybernetics, which is of course a sort of, you might say, enlightened but still machine view of the world, and still carries a providential echo with it if you start talking about the world in terms of feedback and cybernetic terminology, because it seems to imply a designer. I mean, someone had to design any self-regulating human machine, but nobody designed Gaia, at least not until now. So at that level, to rationalize it, one has to think much more organically about memory, about evolution, about filtering or selection, about how complexity comes to be from this continual interplay of the living and the non-living surroundings. So that, I think, marks it out as a little differently as an intellectual project. The other thing that might seem a little bit more than you want to know, but right now I think there is, broadly speaking, three versions of Earth system science. One is Gaia, which I've already talked about enough. One is a very abiotic, a very devoid of life definition of what the Earth system is. It comes from a tradition started by the space agency, NASA, where there could equally be a Mars system or a Venus system or any other planet system, and life just isn't part of the definition or equation. But that misses, for me, the most important thing in the system we're within. And the third approach is what we would associate with a big organizational program that was called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. That is by the by. The important point is it is framed around what's habitability for humans, and how are humans altering their own conditions of habitation. And the mistake it makes is to fixate too narrowly on the human and forget that our conditions of habitation are gifted us by all the other living things. And so you make some mistakes if you zone in too narrowly on, let's just fix on how humans change the world and what's good for humans. Though we need, I believe that although there's some value and a lot of traction in that particular view of an Earth system science, and it's one I sort of semi-participate in, and it led to these concepts like planetary boundaries that you might have heard of, I honestly believe it's too narrow in its compass, and is making a dangerous mistake to forget the rest of life.
You started by uttering the beautiful word biosphere. Mm-hmm. Biosphere is the title of a little book by Vernadsky, who was sort of transitioning from a Tsarist Russia into revolutionary Russia, and his thoughts were that if we are to be revolutionary completely, we need to move from on the evolutionary or revolutionary ladder from the geosphere across the biosphere to the noosphere. the sphere of knowledge. And the idea was that to model the entire rational life of the revolution onto what many people call the Earth system. How different is Gaia from the noosphere? Or Gaia, in particular, Gaia 2.0 from the noosphere? Because on many levels, that had a clear trajectory, a clear stepping in. There is a clear level of higher complexity onto that. But it seems to me that maybe the heterarchy aspect that you were mentioning needs to be unfolded a little bit in understanding that yours is not a rebranding or renaming, or it's not yet another déjà vu of the noosphere. Tell us more about it.
Well, I hope not, for sure, because I think that what I'm trying to articulate is a flourishing future, and the getting there from here necessarily needs to be driven by bottom-up, diversity of bottom-up actions and bottom-up networks formation, with learning by doing, with different networks in different cultural or geographical contexts starting to learn from others' mistakes or successes. I absolutely don't believe in any notion of a planned top-down attainment of collective consciousness or global governance or anything like this, personally. I think that it might be unworkable. It would probably be politically very unpalatable, and I would associate some of the noosphere thinking, Taylor de Chardin. I'm not sure whether I can accuse Vernadsky of it, in more in that vision or version of the future. The other thing I would say is that although Vernadsky had a key insight on the impact of life on the material world, his book, if you read it, The Biosphere, it lacks the historicity, I believe. I think it's very ahistorical, and that's a crucial difference with Lovelock and the Gaia tradition, as well as the fact that Lovelock and Gaia recognize that it's a two-way interplay, but it's not just life influencing the geological world, and it's also the geological world, of course, influencing life, but it's the fact that the totality of that coupling gives rise to a phenomenology that you couldn't guess at if you can only see one side of the equation or the other.
And before I'm going to open it to the floor, one last question about your idea of the network, and particularly the ecological social network. I'm going to be, I don't know how to be straightforward. Isn't this just a renaming of Owenism? That is the tradition that we have to cooperate locally and form societies around cooperation, which has somehow structured the entire history, let's say, of a non-revolutionary left, in particular in this country? How does that link to your notion of revolution?
Well, you're probably catching me in territory I'm not as familiar with as you are, but I would say that just listening to the question, John, I would say that any language of cooperation or competition is still basically overly prescribed by a Darwinian and neo-Darwinian and social Darwinian program that is part of the modernist program, and that we are conditioned, I think, through our education to put the world into those boxes. But if, for example, we go back to look at Gaia again, pre-humans, we shouldn't shoehorn that into presuming it's some great global act of altruism or cooperation, nor should we be vexed totally by seeing competition as something that would destroy its workings. It needs to be seen as the pure waste products of one being become the resource or food for another, and absent any kind of value-laden Darwinist wrapping of it. We need to somehow extricate ourselves, I'm afraid, from that kind of narrow evolutionary framing. Because remember the modernist program, remember that's central to it. And that was part of the central conceit of a parallel between the workings of nature and the workings of society, that we need to break out of that. But in my view, for what it's worth, we need to break out of that particular version of how society is or might be or should be modelled on nature into a very different view of both nature and society.
Fantastic. Now, please come join so that we can have a proper discussion around the table.
So far?
Yeah, this is fantastic. There's some. Alex.
Hi, thank you very much. There's a writer who's written about the Anthropocene who says that the Anthropocene is a pre-trial hearing for assessing culpability in the context of our current predicament. And whether or not you agree with that, it seems to highlight something that a lot of people find problematic with the Anthropocene, which is that it overlooks the possibility that some people are more responsible than others. So certainly the UK has probably played the largest role in developing industrialism. And so I want to get your sense of whether Gaia theory and also theories of tipping points and overlook that notion of responsibility, not just of humans, but of particular humans, and some humans more than others.
Very good question. I would say that there is a danger in the tipping points work, which I would align with this complex systems, purely dynamical systems perspective of the world, that it forgets politics and power and those elements, and that's one of its dangers. And I kind of hinted at the problems of that narrowness in the planetary boundaries framework or the whatever else. I'd like to think that the kind of Gaia and Gaia 2 idea that we're throwing out there is it absolutely has to recognize and wrestle with who the perpetrators are of any given situation and their relative weighting. I mean, that's certainly the way I think about trying to understand Earth history. Some beings had far more culpability in certain changes than others, and I think you're absolutely right. We have to look at our current situation and our own ethical predicament or position in that light. And I'm glad to see we at least seem to internalize that a little as a nation, with recognizing that we really should go net zero as soon as we can. I think that's a tacit acknowledgement that we know that we were a larger part of the problem than the current 1% of emissions year on year that we represent. And instead, I forget the precise fraction, but I suspect our our contribution to cumulative emissions is more in the tens of percent than the few percent. So our responsibility should be according in any politics, yeah.
For me, what remains a problem is the anthropocentricity of our outlook on the whole thing. I lived in Papua New Guinea for a year. There was a 7.4 earthquake. People find that absolutely normal. And especially within the nation state, we expect to be in control. And in a sense, maybe that's partly a false expectation. Maybe we have to learn to live with the uncontrollable. You know, ours is the only planet in the solar system that is based on tectonic plates, for example. You know, and the long-term understanding of the physicality and violence of our planet, and learning to live with that. You know, I mean, many societies use materials to float in floodplains or whatever. You know, there must be ways. You know, Vikings had ships that could go in rough seas. You get the general idea.
Yeah, okay, so two things here. Firstly, yes, there are some convulsions that come from outside, if you like, whether they're from the inside of the Earth or meteorites from space, and the biosphere, or life with a capital L, has had to learn, if you like, to respond to those convulsions. And some human societies have also, perhaps all of us, have learned how, to a degree, how to cope with that. But we've got to distinguish here between the things that might indeed be truly from the outside, from the things which are ultimately where we're the cause or part of the cause. In either case, you're right to highlight that there are some changes now, including climate changes, that are human caused, that are unavoidable, and we've got to be able to learn by doing and learn from experience as we're presented with situations which are alien to our experience up to now. What I mean is, we're going to see we may have made a commitment already to many meters of sea level rise, so we may have made a commitment to have to move major population centres that only grew up in the last 50 years in a planned, architected way, and we may be experiencing already some extreme weather events that are outside of the range of recent human experience. So when presented with new experience or new predicaments, we have to trust in our evolved, to some degree, trust in our evolved capacity to learn to deal with that. But I believe there are ways we can give ourselves more capacity to deal with the unexpected. And we could perhaps talk more, or people from the audience can come in with some more thoughts on what those are. But I think a wise approach to the present, let alone the future, would be to collectively improve our capability to deal with some new forms of surprise that are coming.
And a very basic question: how quickly do you think we can start a serious project on carbon capture? Do you have a calculation on the back of your envelope?
Well, if you think that if you recognise that, I mean, this is a glib answer, and it isn't the whole solution by any stretch of the imagination, but just regenerating the forests we degraded over the last 2 centuries won't solve the climate problem, but it might be able to restore 100 billion tonnes of carbon, which out of the 500 plus that we've emitted. So that's a so-called nature-based solution in the glib language of my colleagues, and it's not the only one, but we're doing that already to a degree, and we could do it, well, if only we could change the politics, which is always the answer, we could do more of that tomorrow. So in other words, we need to change the incentive schemes that which in that case would invest indigenous and local populations in the preservation and restoration of degraded forests in the tropics, because they got more benefit from being part of that than they did going with the oil palm plantation, or whoever was coming in to chop, all the illegal loggers, or whoever was coming in to chop it down, to pursue that particular example. But I know folks across town in London who are busy building enough incentive structure to have, working with those communities to have that become a reality. So in that particular case, it's happening now, and it can happen more, but it's not the whole solution.
Irit.
Thank you. I have a feeling that there's a missing a certain link. So and that's the relation between the reinvestigating the nature of nature, which seems really important, and the kind of political imperative the social political imperative of rescue operations right now, which seems seems to me to have less potential. And where I don't fully understand is the link between those and the demand to create new levels of organization. Because it seems to me that the demand to create new levels of organization kind of contradicts the possibility of reinvestigating the nature of nature.
Oh, good. Yeah, so maybe I'll scrub that slide, or it's gone anyway. I don't. Yeah, because I think there was too much of a sense of progress, shall we say, in the way I might have framed that, and I perhaps miscommunicated what anyway I was conceiving of, because I mean these emerging networks of cities and mayors and transition towns and whatever that are where the real action is on the climate crisis. That to me is what I would call a new kind of organisation. But yeah, okay, let me see if I can give a more thoughtful answer. I think you've kind of nailed it. The reason I've been hesitant to write more on the Gaia 2 idea, which needs a better name, is I think it was essential first to do some work to unpack this program of needing to re-evaluate the nature of nature, and then we might be in a more informed place to talk and think about what a flourishing future looks like, and which if any, bits of nature we might learn from. As I'm trying to navigate, with the help of my friends here, Bruno Latour and others, I think a delicate project where I have no idea at some level what the outcome or any recommendations really might be. I think your point is partly, well, that's all very nice, but how does it sit with the narrative of crisis, climate emergency, we've got to change now in the next 30 years, which I'm also someone whose work is kind of feeding into all the time. I suppose what I would say is I feel we're going nowhere if all we can do is see the apocalypse that's coming, which I'm quite honest and clear about, I hope, or a narrative of basically retreat and consume less, consume less, consume less. I do believe we should consume less, most of us in this country, but I think we aren't getting anywhere collectively because we haven't collectively had a discourse about the flourishing, sustainable future that we actually want to work towards, and the pathway, or the many pathways we could trace from where we are now to there. So whatever I'm doing, and it's pretty incomplete, is trying to, if you weren't doing it already, trying to find some other people to join in that work. And basically, can we collectively come together on a positive vision of what a flourishing and sustainable future that doesn't ransack the rest of the biosphere or Gaia look like? And what's the political project to get there from here? That's...
Yeah, perhaps the misleading term here is organization.
I'm quite happy to chuck that
because
out.
as you speak now, I'm thinking it's more coalitional, and it's more between sort of knowledges that are systemic and knowledges that are organic and material.
Good. I'll take your recommendation.
That maybe where I got stuck was with the term organizational, which I think of as very systemic.
Right. Okay, yeah, I'm certainly familiar with finding myself in situations where terms I use one way, my audience hears another way. This happens to me, especially in interdisciplinary settings all the time. So I then end up feeling horribly hamstrung and almost unable to open my mouth because I suddenly realise that the terminology that has one meaning to me takes a completely different meaning in the ears of the audience. And this is probably a case in point. So we don't need to review what I really think I mean by that, but I'm happy to always nuance my language. I think I'm trying to get at a language of, Latour would say, actor networks. So I'll throw out organisation if you like, but to a scientist it just doesn't carry the baggage it carries to you, which is really interesting. And that's my problem, being I am a scientist by training.
I think my question is kind of an extension of hers. I kind of wrote it down because it's something that I'm looking into in my research as well. So the universe in an operational sense is binary, and anthropologically speaking, social human behavior is not. But I feel like we attempt to mimic the universe or nature by trying to be, and we don't afford ourselves the space to operate outside of a deinstitutionalized system. And the system's rise, or the overlapping moment of the binary and the non-binary, or our insistence to make it work, is what resulted in the rise of the Anthropocene. So how does a new organization solve the issue when I feel like the issue lies in an existing organization of fabricated disparity, or just the insistence to even organize on a world scale? So
well put.
The images you showed earlier about, the population disparity within, borders, and how it kind of changes with the projection that people will migrate to Africa, it comes up a lot in my research. And why is the solution always within, a new type of organization and not the deconstruction of that logic?
Yeah, well put. I mean, the problem, as you put it, I think, is in this cultural tradition we find ourselves in that has made some blunt separations that we're living in the consequences of. So that's why I chastise myself for the disembodied brain diagram, because that's the classic mind-body split where the mind would be associated with the grey matter in the brain, and that's wrong of me to use that imagery because it's meaningless. And the problem here is we separated humans from nature, we separated mind from body, etc., etc., etc. We don't need to have another lecture on that. I hope it comes across, at least in my answers or discussion, that what I'm really talking about is reconnection. I'm really talking about interacting networks of living agents, human or otherwise, and a lot of the interesting stuff that we've been busy forgetting is in the interactions of those networks and in the free will, if I can use the term, of all the different living beings trying to create their own conditions for survival and flourishing, which is sort of part of the definition of being alive. So I think my language is flawed. I'll go away from this evening with that message. But that's the program. That's what if we aren't wrestling with it already, that's what I'm trying to wrestle with is, okay, well, you could have different kinds of acting in networks. We have some agency to make some decisions about what kind of networks we want to form and play in, and those are the conversations or the actions we should be having. And there's always going to be a designed and planned, if you like, element of that with our human agency. So then it's about, okay, what kind of plan or design, and what other agents do we give value to in that planning and design process? And my supposition is it can't just be the other human agents. It's also got to be some of the other living ones.
Do you believe that humans have any agency, or is it within the corporations and the system, the current
I think if you convince yourself that we don't, then the battle's lost. which is a funny kind of answer, isn't it? But as I said somewhere along the way, remember that one tiny bacterial cell that you'd need a very strong microscope to see could ultimately completely transform the world. And the same can be true occasionally, and obviously it's not the norm, but of also presumably one group of human agents. And if we just end up convincing ourselves that the man or the system or the government or some other thing, which is all this illusion of society that Latour has been trying to tell us is just a made-up fiction, unless we can snap out of that presumption that there is this thing, this society, this thing that is constraining us and we can't possibly make a better future, then we're done for.
A phantom public.
A phantom public, yeah. Because we are this. We are whatever it is. We are it, and it's those rules were written by whatever the rules are. They were written by some humans, and they can be changed by some other humans in principle.
So let's rechange it. This is the conclusion of this amazing discussion. Thank you, Tim. You've been very generous in coming all the way from Exeter tonight, which is not as close as many people in London think. So again, thank you for joining us, and join me again with a big round of applause for Tim. We do have drinks on the other side of the hall, but I just need to do some little entertainment here. We have to thank the Graham Foundation for the support of this evening and all the series. And this is a series that is called Plan the Planet because it's the continuation of an ongoing project that we initiated a few years ago on the misunderstandings around a major figure in architecture that initiated all kinds of system thinking and system theories. And somehow should be held accountable for all our mistakes instead of being put on a pedestal as many other people think, among which the notion of self-organization. Thank you very much, Tim. It's been amazing.
Thanks, everybody.